Juliana Adams wanted to be the greatest, watching as everyone else fell on their faces in the cutthroat world of the elite. She looked around and felt like everyone was a fake, but she remained impatient, hoping to one day blow up from the basement of her own history. Her life ran on gold and secrets, and she successfully maneuvered until she took over the attention of the city's most dangerous man, until the night when everything backfired. Juliana should have walked away. She desperately needed to find her exit to treat the lie she had lived, but she just couldn't. The grand ballroom of the Latte Hotel shimmered with a deceptive elegance, a gold-plated stage where Seoul's elite moved like pieces on a board. Juliana Adams watched them all from the balcony, her eyes fixed on the man at the center of the gravity, Kong Tu. He sat in the front row of the private auction, a silhouette of black silk and iron will, untouched by the frantic bidding for ancient vases and forgotten legacies. Juliana knew he didn't care for the art. He was there to remind the city that he owned the air they breathed. She tightened her grip on her champagne flute, every beat of her heart a calculated rhythm for the mission she had built from the basement of her own denied history. The auctioneer's voice rose, desperate to draw heat from the silent crowd, but Tae-woo remained unreadable, a wall of stillness that turned the room cold. Juliana didn't wait for an invitation. She moved through the crowd with a soft laugh, her silk dress brushing against the shadows until she was standing directly in his line of sight. Most people looked away when the Mafia king turned his head, terrified of the gunfire and secrets that followed his name, but Juliana met his guarded eyes and smiled. It was a glance that had taken years to rehearse, a bridge built between the predator he was and the woman she pretended to be. The bidding for a rare Ming Dynasty map reached its peak, the tension in the room thick enough to bleed. Juliana stepped closer, leaning in as if the millions being traded were merely peanuts. She felt the weight of his attention, a heavy, suffocating pressure that had seen through empires of deception. Juliana should have walked away. She desperately needs to find her exit to treat the lie she is spinning. He just can't. She whispered a comment about the map, her voice steady against the silence that usually swallowed everyone else whole. Tae-woo didn't speak, but his grip on his glass tightened slightly. He had built an empire on knowing the fake from the real, yet Juliana stood there, unafraid of the monster everyone else was supposed to fear. "It's a fake," she said, her voice a silk thread in the quiet. "The ink is too new for a king." Tae-woo looked at her then, his gaze studying her as if she were a puzzle he intended to break. She didn't answer. She only watched as he signaled his men to cease the bidding. She had orchestrated the chance, she had won the glance, and now the mission had truly begun. For Juliana, the top was so vacant and she was finally climbing in. The black sedan cut through the neon-soaked rain of Seoul like a blade, moving toward the iron gates of a world where law was a distant memory. Juliana Adams sat in the back seat, the air between her and Kong Tae-woo thick with the silence of a grave. She looked around and felt like the towering glass skyscrapers were closing in, but she remained still, her hands resting calmly on her silk dress. Her life ran on nerves of steel and hidden agendas, and she knew that stepping into the king's shadow was a descent into a basement of no return. The city outside was a blurred mess of light, but inside the car, the top was so vacant, inhabited only by a man who studied her as if she were a threat to be neutralized. The gates of his private estate swung open, revealing a fortress of stone and velvet shadows. Juliana should have walked away when the heavy doors groaned shut behind them, sealing her in with the monster of the East Coast. She desperately needs to find her exit to treat the rising pressure in her chest, but she just can't. Tae-woo led her into a dimly lit hall where his men stood like statues, their eyes tracking her every move with a hunger for her failure. It was the Mafia treatment, a cold welcome designed to shatter the spirit of anyone who dared to stand in his presence. He stopped abruptly, turning to her with a gaze that had seen through empires of lies. He didn't offer a seat or a drink. He offered only the suffocating weight of his suspicion. He waited for her to break, for her eyes to dart in fear or her voice to tremble, but Juliana simply looked back at him, her expression a mirror of his own unreadable mask. She stood in the center of his domain, untouched by the intimidation that broke lesser men. She was a girl with a plan and she would survive this test of wills. "Is this the part where I'm supposed to beg for my life?" she asked, her voice a calm thread in the heavy air. Tae-woo took a step closer, his grip on the moment tightening until the silence screamed. He didn't answer, but for a second the iron in his eyes shifted. She hadn't broken. She had stepped into the shadow and made it her own. Help me make it stranger, she thought as she followed him deeper into the dark. The moon hung low over the Han River, casting a silver light that felt like a warning as Juliana Adams stood on the balcony of Kang Tae-woo's private sanctum. I want to be the greatest, she thought, watching the city lights flicker like a million fakes beneath her feet. I'll make this every day, and I'm impatient, hoping to one day blow up from the basement of the life that had tried to bury her alive. Her life ran on secrets and blood, and she knew the top was so vacant, but she was finally here, breathing the same air as the King of Seoul. Juliana should have walked away months ago, back when the plan was just a desperate inkling on a piece of scrap paper. She desperately needs to find her exit to treat the memory of her family's fall, but she just can't. Behind her, the sliding door groaned open. Tae-woo stepped out, his presence a heavy weight that made the night air feel thin. He didn't move toward her, yet Juliana felt his eyes studying her back as if he could read the motive buried deep in her marrow. For two, this was a game of loyalty, but for Juliana, it was the heir clause, the only way to settle the debt that had haunted her for a decade. She needed a child with the blood of the king, a legacy so powerful it would act as a shield against the monsters still hunting her name. She turned to face him, her silk dress fluttering in the cold wind. She was a girl with a plan, and she would survive the cost of this seduction. You think I'm here for your money too? She asked, her voice a calm thread against the roar of the city below. She didn't let him answer. She stepped into his space, her touch light yet calculated, proving she wasn't afraid of the monster the world feared. She needed his heir to buy her freedom, and she would make it happen, even if it meant losing herself in the shadows of his empire. Help me make it stranger, she whispered to the dark as she drew the king into her ultimate trap. The neon lights of Myeongdong bled into the slick, rain-washed pavement, a kaleidoscope of artificial colors that felt like a trap closing in on Juliana Adams. I want to be the greatest, she thought as she navigated the crowded alleys, her breath hitching as the shadows of the city seemed to stretch toward her. I look around and feel like everybody is the fake, she realized, watching the tourists disappear into the mist while four figures detach themselves from the darkness of a side street. Her life runs on gold and secrets, but tonight the cold beauty of Seoul felt like a basement where she was being buried alive. The top is so vacant, she reminded herself, but as the men surrounded her, the weight of the air felt heavy enough to drown her. Juliana should have walked away before she led them into the dead-end alley. She desperately needs to find her exit to treat the fear rising in her throat, but she just can't. The lead thug stepped forward, a message from a rival gang flashing in his eyes as he reached for her. Before he could touch her, a black sedan screeched to a halt at the alley's entrance, and Kang Tae-woo stepped out like a god of vengeance. He didn't waste words. He moved with a speed that made the rain seem to stand still, his presence turning the alley into a cage for the men who had dared to touch what belonged to him. As he cleared the path, his gaze locked onto Juliana, his grip on her arm tightening with a heat that wasn't just about protection. Tae-woo pulled her toward him, his body a wall between her and the city's violence. In that moment he realized he wasn't just guarding a contract. He was becoming possessive of the woman who had invaded his empire. You're mine, Juliana, he said, his voice a calm thread against the downpour. Don't ever think about running. She leaned into him, the lines between her strategy and his emotion blurring in the cold night. She had sought the king for an heir, but she had found a master who wouldn't let her go. Help me make it stranger, she thought as he swept her into the car and away from the rainy streets. The private library of the Kang estate was a sanctuary of dark wood and heavy silence, a room where secrets were buried deeper than the foundations of Seoul. Juliana Adams stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker through the mist like the dying embers of a fake world. I want to be the greatest, she reminded herself, but as she looked at the man sitting motionless behind the mahogany desk, she felt her resolve thinning. I look around and feel like everybody is the fake, but Kang Tae-woo was a wall of unreadable stone that no calculated touch could crack. Her life runs on gold and secrets, but in this quiet room, the top felt so vacant that the weight of her own lies began to pull her back toward the basement. Juliana should have walked away before the silence became a cage. She desperately needs to find her exit to treat the suffocating pressure of her own script, but she just can't. She turned away from the window, her silk dress rustling like a whisper in the vast room. Tae-woo didn't look up, his presence a heavy, airless force that made the space feel small. He remained a masterpiece of stillness, his guarded eyes fixed on a ledger as if she weren't even there. Juliana realized that her practiced laughs and orchestrated glances were bouncing off him like water on glass. To reach him she had to drop the mask. She stepped into the pool of light on his desk, her voice trembling, not from a rehearsed fear, but from the terrifying reality of her own exposure. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve with a genuine shake that no mission could have taught her. She wasn't playing the nurse or the socialite anymore. She was just a woman drowning in the shadow of a king. "I'm scared Tae-woo," she whispered, the honesty of the words cutting through the heavy air like a blade. "I'm scared of how much I need you to look at me." He finally looked up, his gaze studying her with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. For the first time his grip on his pen loosened, his unreadable mask slipping just enough to let her in. "Help me make it stranger," she thought as she realized that her vulnerability was the only weapon that could truly disarm him. She had abandoned the script, and in the silence, the real seduction had finally begun. The quiet glow of the firelight danced against the dark walls of the master suite, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to swallow the remains of Juliana Adams's carefully constructed world. "I want to be the greatest," she had once told herself, but as she leaned into the solid warmth of Kang Tae-woo, the top felt so vacant that she could no longer breathe the thin air of her own lies. "I look around and feel like everybody is the fake," she realized, yet the man holding her was a heavy, undeniable truth that made her basement of secrets feel like a tomb. Her life runs on gold and secrets. But in the flicker of the hearth, the gold was melting and the secrets were turning to ash. Juliana should have walked away before his grip became the only thing keeping her from shattering. She desperately needs to find her exit to treat the ache of her awakening heart, but she just can't. Wrapped in his arms, the lines between her mission and her reality blurred until she couldn't tell where the strategy ended and the woman began. Tae-woo's unreadable mask had shifted, his breathing a steady rhythm that anchored her to the present. He studied her with a gaze that usually saw through empires of deception, yet his hold on her tightened slightly, as if he were afraid she might disappear into the very shadows she had emerged from. Juliana looked up at him, her voice trembling, not from the fear of the monster the world knew but of herself. The mission was dying, suffocated by the heat of a connection she had never planned for. "I'm scared. I'm already falling for you," she whispered, the confession a silk thread snapping in the quiet. Tae-woo didn't answer with words, but something about her felt dangerously real to a man who had built his throne on the fake. For the first time the king hesitated in love, his eyes softening only when they met hers. "Help me make it stranger," she thought as the strategist in her fell silent, leaving only the woman who had finally found home in the dark. The morning sun crawled over the glass spires of Seoul, but inside the Kang headquarters the air was as cold as a tomb. "I want to be the greatest," Juliana Adams reminded herself as she moved through the sterile hallways, but she looked around and felt like everybody was the fake. Her life ran on gold and secrets, yet the top was so vacant that every footstep felt like a countdown to her own destruction. She had spent years climbing out of the basement of her past, but the higher she reached, the more the shadows of the empire seemed to stretch toward her throat. Juliana should have walked away before the eyes of the syndicate turned into a microscope. She desperately needs to find her exit to treat the growing evidence of her lies, but she just can't. In a dimly lit surveillance room, Tae-woo's right-hand man stared at a screen, his unreadable expression mirroring the king's own guarded nature. He had found a discrepancy, a small, silent gap in Juliana's background that didn't match the story she had sold to the world. The right-hand man didn't move, his presence a heavy force that signaled the beginning of the hunt. He knew deception, and he had built his own loyalty on protecting the king from the very fakes Juliana represented. Juliana felt the shift in the atmosphere, a suffocating pressure that suggested her velvet shadows were no longer enough to hide the truth. She was a girl with a plan, but the Empire's doubt was a monster that didn't sleep off the pain. She caught the right-hand man's gaze in the reflection of a glass wall, and for a second her voice nearly failed her. She didn't show her fear. She kept her head high, even as the hunt for her secret began in the dark corners of the city. "Help me make it stranger," she thought, knowing that if the syndicate found the truth, it wouldn't just threaten her bond with Tae-woo, it would shatter the world she had fought so hard to steal. The scent of expensive ink and cold ambition filled the executive office as Juliana Adams looked at the digital file on the desk, a weapon disguised as data. I want to be the greatest, she reminded herself, watching the city lights of Seoul sparkle like a million fakes through the floor-to-ceiling glass. I'll make this every day, and I'm impatient, hoping to one day blow up from the basement of her own history, but the top was so vacant and the air here was starting to feel like a cage. Her life runs on gold and secrets, and today the price of her secret was the destruction of a man she didn't even know. Juliana should have walked away before the syndicate demanded a blood sacrifice for her supposed loyalty. She desperately needs to find her exit to treat the stain on her soul, but she just can't. Tae-woo stood by the window, his presence a heavy, unreadable force that anchored her to the crime she was about to commit. He didn't look at her, yet his grip on the moment was suffocating, forcing her to choose between her mission and her morality. To prove she was more than a velvet shadow, she had to sabotage his rival, pulling a digital trigger that would shatter an empire and draw her deeper into the blood-stained roots of the syndicate. She clicked the final command, her fingers steady despite the terrifying reality that she was no longer just an observer in his world. She was a participant in his darkness. She was a girl with a plan, and she would survive the weight of this betrayal. It's done, she said, her voice a calm thread in the quiet room. Tae-woo turned, his guarded eyes softening only when they met hers, as if he were afraid she might disappear into the guilt she was now wearing. Help me make it stranger, she thought as she realized that with every crime she committed for him, the lines between her strategy and her heart were being erased by the firelight. She had bought her place by his side with the ruin of another, and the truth was starting to feel dangerously real. The morning mist clung to the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, turning the vibrant Seoul skyline into a blurred gallery of fakes. Juliana Adams stood alone in the marble bathroom, the silence of the suite heavy enough to drown the city below. I want to be the greatest, she whispered to her reflection, but her voice felt like a stranger's in the vacant air. I look around and feel like everybody is the fake, she realized, yet the small plastic stick in her hand was a truth so loud it threatened to shatter the basement of her soul. Her life runs on gold and secrets, and today the gold had turned to lead. The top is so vacant, and for the first time she felt the terrifying height of her own climb. Juliana should have walked away before the mission took root in her own body. She desperately needs to find her exit to treat the rising tide of guilt, but she just can't. She walked back into the bedroom, her footsteps swallowed by the heavy silk carpets. Tae-woo was still asleep, his unreadable mask softened by the shadows of the early hour. The Heir she had once seen as a mere means to an end was now a reality, a biological bridge between her deception and his heart. She had planned for the seduction, the manipulation, and the cold calculations of power, but she hadn't planned for the way her chest would ache at the sight of him. The root of connection was no longer a strategy. It was a heartbeat. She sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers trembling as she watched him breathe. Every soft laugh she had rehearsed, every calculated touch she had delivered, now felt like a debt that would never be paid. The guilt began to suffocate her, a velvet shadow that grew longer with every second she kept the truth hidden. She was a girl with a plan, but the plan was now a living thing that could either bind them together or tear them apart. I'm sorry, she mouthed to the quiet room, her voice a silk thread in the dark. Tae-woo stirred, his grip on the sheets tightening slightly as if he sensed her distance. Help me make it stranger, she thought as she realized that the Heir she had sought to secure her future had instead become the weapon that would eventually shatter her world. The lines between strategy and emotion had finally vanished, leaving only a woman terrified of the monster she had grown to love. The rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the syndicate's main office, a relentless sound that felt like the city itself was trying to break inside. I want to be the greatest, Tae-woo thought as he stared at the digital trail illuminated on his desk, a cold map of every calculated touch and whispered lie Juliana Adams had used to breach his walls. I look around and feel like everybody is the fake, he realized, but the betrayal in his hands was a truth so sharp it made the top feel more vacant than ever before. Her life runs on gold and secrets, and he had finally found the basement where she had buried the real version of herself. The air in the room was heavy, a suffocating silence that signaled the king's world was about to shatter. Tae-woo should have called for his men the moment the first discrepancy surfaced. He desperately needs to find his exit to treat the poison of her deception, but he just can't. He studied the evidence. the photos of her meetings, the traces of her true mission, the cold reality that she had entered his world to steal an heir for her own survival. The command to destroy her was on the tip of his tongue, yet his grip on the phone remained loose. For the first time, the king hesitated in power because he was drowning in love. He knew deception. He had built an empire on it, yet something about her felt dangerously real even in the middle of the lie. He looked at the door, expecting her to walk in with that soft laugh he now knew was part of the mission. He was falling for the one person he should destroy, a realization that turned his iron will into a cage of his own making. He closed the file, the silence of the office screaming with the weight of what he was ignoring. He didn't call the guards. He didn't order the execution. He only sat in the dark, watching the rain, terrified of the moment she would disappear. "Help me make it stranger," he thought as the lines between his duty and his heart vanished in the quiet glow of the city lights. The truth was surfacing, and it was going to shatter everything they had built. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Hyatt ballroom shattered the light into 1,000 jagged reflections, casting a cold, artificial glow over the high-stakes theater of Seoul's underworld. Juliana Adams stood at the center of the room, her silk dress a shimmering lie as she leaned into Kang Tae-woo's side. "I want to be the greatest," she thought, watching the elite whisper behind their hands like a gallery of fakes. "I look around and feel like everybody is the fake, but tonight the top felt so vacant that the ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Her life runs on gold and secrets, and she knew the basement of her past was finally reaching out to pull her back down." The gala music died in an instant as a rival's voice projected across the hall, reading the cold, hard facts of Juliana's mission. The truth surfaced, a digital scream that revealed every calculated glance and every orchestrated touch she had used to reach the king. Tae-woo stood frozen, his presence a heavy, suffocating force as the syndicate watched their untouchable leader be humiliated by a woman with a plan. Juliana should have walked away before the world saw her as the strategist she was. She desperately needs to find her exit to treat the shock of her exposure, but she just can't. Tae-woo's guarded eyes turned to ice, his grip on his glass tightening until the stems snapped. He didn't yell, he didn't even move, yet the silence he radiated was louder than any gunfire. The humiliation was a weight that turned his love into a cage of iron and shadow. Before Juliana could speak, his men surrounded her, their faces unreadable as they dragged her away from the chandeliers and toward the interrogation room in the bowels of the estate. She was a girl with a plan, but as the heavy steel door slammed shut, she realized the lines between strategy and emotion had finally shattered. In the dark of the interrogation room, she waited for the monster she had grown to love. "Help me make it stranger," she thought as she felt the air she carried stir within her, the only thing left binding them together. The basement interrogation room was a concrete tomb, far removed from the gold-plated chandeliers of the gala. Juliana Adams sat under the single swinging bulb, her shadows stretching toward the corners like the dying remains of her plan. "I want to be the greatest," she reminded herself, but as the heavy steel door groaned open, the top felt so vacant that she couldn't find the air to breathe. "I look around and feel like everybody is the fake, but the man stepping into the pool of light was a truth so heavy it threatened to crush her. Her life runs on gold and secrets, and tonight, the basement had finally claimed its prize." Kang Tae-woo stood before her, his presence a suffocating force that turned the cold air into a cage. Juliana should have walked away before her strategy became her soul. She desperately needs to find her exit to treat the agony of his silence, but she just can't. He didn't reach for a weapon or a command. Instead, he leaned into her space, his guarded eyes searching her face with a desperation that mirrored her own. He didn't want the lies or the mission details. He demanded the one thing she had spent her life hiding. "Tell me," he said, his voice a calm thread snapping in the quiet. "Tell me what was dangerously real." Juliana looked up at him, her voice trembling, not from fear of his power, but of the connection that had taken root in the dark. She admitted everything. The mission to secure an heir, the calculated touches, and the moment the strategy had died in the firelight. It was their most honest conversation, a painful shedding of silk and armor that left them both exposed. "I didn't plan for you," she whispered, her fingers reaching out to touch his sleeve. Tae-woo didn't pull away. His grip on the moment tightened slightly, his unreadable mask finally shattering. For the first time, the king was not a monster or a master, but a man drowning in a love born from manipulation. Help me make it stranger, she thought as she realized that even with the glass shattered, the air she carried was the only thing still binding their broken pieces together. The night sky over the Kong estate erupted in a symphony of fire and steel as rivals launched a desperate attack on the stronghold, hoping to take advantage of the king's supposed weakness. I want to be the greatest, Tae-woo thought as he watched the perimeter cameras flicker and die, but he looked around and felt like everybody was the fake. His life ran on gold and secrets, yet the top was so vacant that the sounds of gunfire felt like a countdown to his own destruction. Inside the reinforced safe room, Juliana Adams doubled over, her breath hitching as the first sharp contraction claimed her body. Her life had been a series of calculated touches and silk lies, but the basement of her reality was finally reaching out to pull her into the truth. Juliana should have walked away before the mission became a living thing. She desperately needs to find her exit to treat the rising agony of the labor, but she just can't. Tae-woo stood at the heavy steel door, his presence a suffocating force as he listened to the chaos outside and the screams of his woman within. The Mafia king was forced to choose between the empire he had built on blood and the family that had taken root in his heart. His men waited for the command to strike back, but Tae-woo's guarded eyes were fixed on the woman who had invaded his soul. He didn't leave her side to lead the counterattack. He stayed, his grip on her hand tightening as he chose the fragile bond over the cold crown. Juliana was a girl with a plan and she would survive this transformation. The heir's first breath cut through the silence of the room, a silk thread of hope in the middle of the war. Tae-woo looked at his son, his unreadable mask finally shattering as he realized that the king had finally found something worth losing everything for. Help me make it stranger, he thought as the lines between his empire and his love vanished in the quiet glow of the new life. The golden glow of the sunset washed over the sprawling Kong estate, painting the reclaimed empire in shades of triumph and peace. Juliana Adams stood on the terrace, watching the city of Seoul twinkle like a collection of fakes that no longer held power over her heart. I want to be the greatest, she thought, but as she looked at the man and child beside her, the top no longer felt vacant. She had spent years climbing from the basement of her history, but her life no longer ran on gunfire and blood. It ran on the quiet strength of a family that was dangerously real. Juliana should have walked away a year ago when the truth threatened to shatter everything. She desperately needs to find her exit to treat the lingering memories of her own deception, but she just can't. Tae-woo stepped out to join her, his presence a heavy, anchoring force that turned the evening air into a sanctuary. The Mafia king had rebuilt his world, but the lines between strategy and emotion had finally vanished for good. He looked at his heir, the child Juliana had once planned as a means to an end, and realized that the boy was the only thing that had ever made him truly human. Tae-woo reached out, his grip on the moment tightening slightly as he pulled Juliana and their son into his arms. He knew deception, but as his guarded eyes softened, he saw only the truth of the connection that had taken root in the dark. I'm coming back for you, Mia. He had once whispered in the chaos and now in the stillness he had finally arrived. Juliana leaned her head against his shoulder, the final strategy complete. The heir was no longer a tool for power, but the heartbeat of a dynasty born from manipulation and saved by love. Help me make it stranger, she thought as they watched the city lights, knowing that their bond would never be shattered again.